I find like when I'm talking to people who are very, very different than me, luckily I also have a kid, which um can hit a lot of people. But two things that he agreed with that I hesitate to say to people are like sometimes anti-capitalist points. And also I do have a lot of like Middle Eastern related points. But if I say like I used to live in Syria, so I know what it's like when there's just not any water. Like sometimes people are like, "Oh, she's a snob," or it's just so far beyond their imagining. So then I'm like, should I go with like California? Right? Like that's I also know people who live in California and have no water and anyway, so I struggle with like those things are very authentic to me,
Hmm.
but also if I know the person I'm talking to and they either like anyway, like do you cherry pick the parts of yourself that they're gonna like the most, or do you just like go with your honest points?
So it's a great question. The I wouldn't think about sort of cherry picking, but I think in a longer conversation, when you're doing the listening first in terms of what they're sharing, you try to match what they're sharing in terms of their vulnerability with how much you're, with you being vulnerable. And so you're trying to find the places of commonality, of common values. At some point in a conversation or in a relationship, if you think that somebody's worldview is not where it needs to be, right? You can do the political education and agitation and not lose them. Um, but I think that, in a conversation like with me, like if you were having a one-on-one with me, I would probably at some point bring up the Middle East and like Egypt, right? Like, and you would say, I've been to Syria, I've lived there, like let me like tell you, right? And like for me, that would be like, oh, like the person I'm talking to like really does understand, right? Like um the sort of international like scope and the implications for like the region where my father comes from and where I was born, right? Like to me, I would respond very like positively to that. So I think it's not it may not be the answer that you want to hear, but a lot of this just comes down to instinct and what you're hearing from the person. This is not a cherry picking, but it's just how do you connect and relate to this person that you're trying to build with and still being yourself.
Mhm.
Um, so don't lose yourself in this conversation, right? Like this is supposed to be an authentic conversation, and you're trying to connect with the person that you're talking to or with.
We're a little bit on time, but I think this is a really valuable conversation. So Elle,
I just have one more thing to add, because I think that that's a really important question, because we want to form connection, but at what, like at what form of omission? And I think what I have found is like you don't necessarily come guns a-blazing with the anti-capitalism, even if that is like what is going on in my brain 90% of the time. And part of that is like if you are speaking to somebody who's not there yet, or who maybe is working their way, right? You're talking to them for a reason. You share some sorts of values, but the whole point of this sort of one-on-one is that it's the first conversation. It's not the last. So like that, you don't need to necessarily be like, this is my whole entire life story. You can just be like, hey, I want to see you again after this, not in a weird date way, but like, I want to see you again at an action. I want to see you again at a meeting. Like, we've had this like nice talk. We got something going. Let's like see each other again. Right. And it is the start. You are planting the seeds. You are finding those points. So that way, eventually a month or 2 months down the line, you are comfortable enough where you can highlight those things and be like, hey man, like you said this thing in a meeting that just was a little bit strange about Elon Musk. And I just want to talk about that, and then you can start to push a little bit once, you guys are cool. That's my thought.
So it is like a first date. Like don't lead with like I want to have 6 kids. Like
that's really
Tease
good.
them just a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll also just really quickly add from my experience, like there are definitely parts of my story that are more vulnerable and more things that I'm really open to sharing. And I think that sometimes as you're organizing, like you'll find that there's times where people need to hear the stories from your life that show the narrative that you're trying to display, right? Like sometimes I talk about like my experiences working in the legislature and like some of the challenges that I had there, and that there will be times where people need to hear a model from my life to motivate them to do that action. And so that's also one of the tool, like that's why we can also think of this as a little bit of a tool as well for organizing. So yeah, I think you're really tracking.